A baby grizzly bear, lost in the middle of a raging snowstorm. Alone, starving, and freezing, he had nowhere to go. But then, he saw a man, a stranger, walking through the icy wilderness. Desperate, the cub did something no one expected. He followed him. 6 miles. Through brutal winds and knee-deep snow, the tiny bear trailed behind, his weak cries drowned by the storm. The man turned around, and what he did next shocked everyone. This is a story of survival, an unbreakable bond, and a moment that would change both their lives forever. Stay with us until the end. You won't believe what happens next. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, tearing through the endless white expanse of Wyoming's backcountry. Heavy snow blanketed the forest, burying everything in an unforgiving silence. It was the kind of storm that could swallow anything in its path. Trees, animals, even the strongest men. Ethan Carter, a seasoned wildlife researcher, pulled his coat tighter around his body as he trudged through the thick snow. He had spent the morning tracking a group of elk near Yellowstone National Park, but now, with visibility dropping to near zero, he knew he needed to turn back. His cabin was still miles away, and the temperature was plummeting fast. Then, he heard it. A faint cry. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him. But then it came again. A weak, desperate whimper. Ethan stopped, his breath visible in the freezing air. He scanned the storm, searching for the source of the sound. And then, just a few feet away, he saw it. A tiny grizzly cub, barely bigger than a golden retriever, was struggling through the snow, its fur soaked and matted with ice. The little bear was alone, no mother in sight. Ethan's chest tightened. A grizzly cub this small wouldn't survive the night, not in a storm like this. The cub locked eyes with him. Fear, exhaustion, a silent plea. Ethan knew better than to interfere with nature. If a cub was alone, it usually meant the mother had abandoned it, or worse, had been killed. A mother bear would never willingly leave her cub behind. The little bear took a shaky step toward him, then another. Ethan exhaled sharply. He's following me. The cub let out another pitiful cry, then stumbled forward, nearly collapsing into the snow. Ethan hesitated. He couldn't take the cub. It was illegal to interfere with wild grizzlies, and even if he did, raising a bear was impossible. The cub would eventually grow too strong, too wild, and would never learn to survive on its own. But the storm wasn't letting up. If the cub stayed here, it wouldn't last the night. Ethan turned and started walking again, and that's when he heard the soft crunching of snow behind him. He turned back. The cub was following him. Step after step, despite the howling wind and the bone-chilling cold, the little bear trailed behind him. For 6 miles. Ethan didn't stop. He didn't encourage the cub, but he didn't chase it away either. He knew the harsh truth. If he left the cub behind, it would be dead by morning. But what was he supposed to do? His cabin was still miles away, and bringing the cub back would change everything. And then, Ethan made a decision. A choice that would lead to a bond he never could have imagined. The storm showed no mercy. The wind whipped against Ethan's face, stinging his skin like tiny daggers. Snow swirled around him, erasing the landscape with every passing second. But none of that compared to the weight in his chest as he glanced behind him. The little grizzly cub was still there. Its tiny paws sank deep into the snow with each step. It trembled violently, barely able to keep up. Yet something inside that tiny creature refused to give up. It kept moving forward, trailing Ethan like a shadow. Ethan clenched his jaw. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. He knew the rules. You don't take in wild animals. You don't interfere with nature. The cub's best chance of survival was finding its mother, if she was still alive. But Ethan had spent years studying the wild. He knew what this meant. If the cub was alone, it wasn't because its mother was out hunting. It wasn't because she would return. She was gone. Whether by the teeth of a predator or the barrel of a hunter's rifle, she wasn't coming back. And that left this little one alone in a world that did not forgive weakness. Ethan tried to keep moving, to ignore the gnawing guilt in his gut. But then, he heard a sound that stopped him cold. The cub collapsed. Ethan turned sharply. The little bear lay sprawled in the snow, its small body heaving from exhaustion. Its fur was coated in ice, and its breathing had become labored. Ethan cursed under his breath. If the cub didn't freeze, it would starve. If it didn't starve, something else would find it before sunrise. He knew he was out of options. With a sigh, Ethan knelt in the snow, slowly reaching out his gloved hand. The cub barely reacted, its dark eyes dull with exhaustion. "That's it," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to the bear. "You win." Carefully, he removed his heavy backpack and reached inside. He didn't have much, just some dried meat and trail mix. He tore a strip of jerky and hesitated. "Not exactly a salmon run, but it'll have to do." He placed the food in front of the cub. It sniffed the offering weakly before hesitating. Then, with slow, trembling bites, it ate. Ethan watched in silence. He had seen grizzlies before, strong, massive, terrifying creatures that ruled the wilderness. But this cub? It was barely more than a fragile heartbeat against the cold. The moment the cub finished, it looked up at Ethan, those dark eyes locking onto him again. And that was when Ethan realized the truth. This wasn't just a wild animal. It was a lost soul, clinging to the only thing it had left in this world. Him. Ethan exhaled sharply. He was about to make a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Without another thought, he removed his thick outer coat, wrapping the cub in its warmth. Then, with a grunt of effort, he lifted the small bear into his arms. It was heavier than he expected, but not by much. The cub was too weak to resist, its body pressing against Ethan's chest. "All right, little guy," he muttered. "Let's get you out of here." With the storm raging around them, Ethan adjusted his grip and started moving again. The weight of the cub pressed against him, but he didn't stop. He pushed forward through the blizzard, step by step, carrying the little grizzly toward whatever fate awaited them both. Neither of them knew what lay ahead. But one thing was certain. They weren't alone anymore. The storm raged on, a furious blizzard swallowing the landscape in a relentless assault of ice and wind. Ethan's cabin was still nearly a mile away, but every step felt like a battle. His arms ached from carrying the cub, and the snow was now waist-deep in some areas. But he didn't stop. The cub barely moved in his grip, its body limp from exhaustion. Ethan could feel the faint rise and fall of its chest against him, but the warmth was fading. He adjusted his hold, pulling his coat tighter around the small bear. "Just hold on, little guy," he muttered through chattering teeth. "Almost there." The outline of his cabin appeared like a shadow in the storm. It wasn't much, just a modest wooden structure built decades ago, a place of solitude and study. A single lantern glowed faintly in the window, a beacon against the icy darkness. Ethan reached the door, kicking off the heavy snow as he shifted the cub's weight. With stiff fingers, he fumbled with the lock before shoving the door open. Heat rushed out to meet him. The cabin's fireplace had been left burning low, and the sudden warmth felt like a shock to his frozen skin. He stepped inside, kicking the door shut behind him. The cub made a soft noise, a weak, pitiful whimper. Ethan wasted no time. He knelt on the wooden floor, placing the small bear near the hearth. The fire crackled, sending flickering light across the room. The cub didn't move. A sharp pang of fear gripped Ethan's chest. Was it too late? "No," he muttered, shaking off the thought. He wasn't about to give up now. He pulled off his wet gloves and reached for a thick wool blanket from the corner. Wrapping the cub in it, he placed his hands on its icy fur, rubbing gently to generate warmth. The little bear stirred slightly, its nose twitching. "That's it," Ethan whispered. "Come on, buddy. Stay with me." Minutes passed. The fire popped and hissed, sending waves of heat through the room. Slowly, ever so slowly, the cub's breathing grew steadier. Its tiny paws flexed beneath the blanket, and a soft sigh escaped its muzzle. Relief flooded Ethan's body. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to sit back, exhaling deeply. His muscles ached, his clothes were soaked, and exhaustion clawed at his mind. But none of it mattered. The cub was alive. Ethan ran a hand through his damp hair, his eyes never leaving the small creature. It was still fragile, still weak, but there was fight left in it. He could see it now. A survivor. He stood slowly, peeling off his wet coat and hanging it near the fire. The cabin was quiet except for the crackling wood and the occasional howl of wind outside. As he moved to grab some food for himself, a small noise made him stop. A rustling. He turned back. The cub, still wrapped in the blanket, had shifted slightly. Its dark eyes blinked open, glassy and confused. For a moment, it simply stared at Ethan, as if trying to make sense of what had happened. Then, to his surprise, the little bear let out a soft, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a whimper, a sound of trust. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He had spent his life studying wildlife, observing from a distance, always reminding himself not to interfere. He had seen the cruelty of nature, the unforgiving rules that dictated survival. But this was different. This wasn't just an animal. This was a life that had chosen to follow him, a life that, against all odds, had put its trust in him. Ethan took a slow step forward, lowering himself to the floor beside the cub. Carefully, he reached out. The bear didn't flinch. It didn't move away. Instead, for the first time since the storm began, it closed its eyes and rested. Ethan swallowed hard. He had no idea what he had just gotten himself into. But one thing was certain. This cub wasn't going anywhere. The blizzard finally began to ease by morning, but the cold remained unforgiving. The storm had dumped nearly 2 feet of fresh snow outside, leaving the landscape frozen and unrecognizable. Inside the cabin, however, the warmth from the fire had created a small haven, a fragile barrier against the brutal winter. Ethan sat in his chair, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the small bundle of fur near the hearth. The cub had barely moved throughout the night, curled tightly in the wool blanket. Every so often, Ethan would lean forward, watching for the steady rise and fall of its tiny chest. Each breath reassured him that the little bear was still fighting. But he knew this was just the beginning. The cub needed food, warmth, and, most importantly, time to regain its strength. Ethan had spent years studying grizzlies, but never had he taken care of one. He had no idea if this was even possible. Yet, here they were. As if sensing his gaze, the cub stirred, letting out a soft, raspy whimper. Ethan leaned forward. "Hey, buddy," he murmured. "You're still with me, huh?" The little bear blinked up at him, eyes still glassy with exhaustion. Ethan reached for the small plate of mashed berries and softened jerky he had prepared. It wasn't much, certainly not what a grizzly should be eating, but it was all he had for now. Carefully, he placed the plate near the cub. It hesitated, nose twitching, before weakly lifting its head. For a moment, Ethan worried it wouldn't have the strength to eat. But then, with slow, deliberate movements, the bear licked at the berries, its tiny tongue barely making contact. Ethan exhaled. That's it. Just a little at a time. The cub ate only a few bites before exhaustion pulled it back into sleep. But it was enough. It meant there was still fight left in the little creature, and Ethan would make sure that fight didn't go to waste. The wind had died down, but the silence outside was anything but comforting. Ethan knew better than to ignore the warning signs. The howl he had heard wasn't just a passing call, it was a signal. Coyotes hunted in packs, and in the dead of winter, hunger made them bolder. If they had caught the scent of the cub, they wouldn't hesitate to get closer. Ethan tightened his grip on the rifle, his mind racing. He had dealt with predators before, but this was different. He wasn't alone. A soft rustling came from behind him. He turned to see the cub shifting in its sleep, its small body stretching slightly beneath the wool blanket. It was unaware of the danger just beyond the walls of the cabin. Ethan exhaled, glancing back at the window. He had no intention of letting anything get close to the little bear. He moved toward the front door, slowly undoing the latch. Stepping outside, the cold hit him instantly, but he ignored it. His boots sank into the fresh snow as he scanned the tree line. The forest was still. Too still. Then, movement. A flicker of motion between the trees. A pair of glowing eyes. Then another. Ethan's stomach tightened. 3, maybe 4. They were watching, waiting. He raised the rifle but didn't fire. Not yet. He didn't want to provoke them unless he had to. A sharp yip echoed through the trees, and one of the coyotes took a cautious step forward. Ethan squared his stance, steadying his aim. "Not tonight," he muttered under his breath. The coyote hesitated, ears twitching. It knew. Ethan wasn't prey. But the cub inside? That was a different story. The standoff lasted seconds, but it felt like hours. The pack lingered, testing their limits, their hunger pushing them closer. Then, another sound. A low, rumbling growl. Not from Ethan. From behind him. He turned just in time to see the little cub, standing unsteadily in the doorway, its blanket slipping from its back. Its fur bristled, tiny claws digging into the wooden floor. And for the first time, Ethan saw it. The instinct. The fight. The tiny bear let out another growl, louder this time. It was small, weak, but it was a warning, a declaration. Ethan's chest tightened. This cub wasn't ready for the wild, but deep inside, it was still a grizzly. And grizzlies didn't run. The coyotes hesitated. One more second, two. Then, slowly, they retreated. The darkness swallowed them again. Ethan exhaled, lowering the rifle. It wasn't over. They would be back, but not tonight. Ethan turned back to the cub, shaking his head. "You really think you're tough, huh?" The little bear blinked up at him, swaying slightly before nearly collapsing onto the wooden floor. Ethan caught it just in time. All right. Let's get you back inside." He carried the cub back to the warmth of the fire, settling it down carefully. The little bear let out a deep sigh, its body relaxing instantly. Ethan sat down beside it, rubbing his face with both hands. What was he doing? This wasn't sustainable. He had kept the cub alive through the storm. But what now? He couldn't just keep it. He couldn't teach it how to be a bear. And yet, the idea of turning it over to some facility, of sending it away to an uncertain fate. It didn't sit right. Ethan leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. The cub had fought to survive. It had followed him through the storm. It had trusted him. And now, he was the only thing standing between it and the dangers of the world outside. Ethan closed his eyes. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just about survival anymore. Maybe this was about something bigger. The fire crackled softly in the cabin, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. Outside, the wind had settled into a whisper, but the events of the night still weighed heavily on Ethan's mind. The coyotes had backed off, for now. But they'd be back. Hunger made animals desperate. And the cub? Ethan looked down at the small bear, curled up beside the fire. Its tiny body rose and fell with steady breaths, exhaustion pulling it into deep sleep. It had stood its ground tonight, as weak as it was. There was no doubt. It had the spirit of a grizzly. But spirit alone wouldn't be enough to keep it alive. Ethan ran a hand through his unkempt hair, exhaling slowly. He had spent his life respecting the laws of nature, never interfering beyond observation. But this time, nature had made its decision already. This cub should have died in the snow. Instead, it had followed him, 6 miles through the storm, past every impossible obstacle, as if some unseen force had willed it to survive. And now, it was in his care. Ethan stood abruptly, moving to the small wooden table near the window. He reached for his old satellite radio, fingers hesitating over the worn buttons. He could still call it in. There were wildlife rehabilitation centers, professionals who could take the cub in and do what he couldn't. They could teach it how to be a bear again. They could give it a future. His thumb hovered over the transmission button. But no matter how much he tried to convince himself, something didn't feel right. Would they truly give it a future? Or just a life behind metal fences? Would it ever know the wild again? Ethan clenched his jaw, lowering the radio. The cub stirred slightly, letting out a small, content huff in its sleep. He had promised himself he wouldn't interfere with nature, but maybe this wasn't interference. Maybe this was fate. Dawn was breaking when Ethan made his decision. He wouldn't call it in. Not yet. The cub needed to regain its strength first. It needed time. If it was going to survive on its own, Ethan had to be sure it was ready. He glanced at the rifle near the door. The world outside wasn't safe, and the cub was still fragile. If Ethan was going to help it, he had to teach it how to survive. How to be a bear again. A real one. One that didn't need humans. One that could face the wild and win. He looked down at the little creature beside the fire, watching the way it twitched slightly in its sleep, lost in some distant dream. "You're not just any bear, are you?" Ethan murmured. The cub let out a tiny, sleepy growl in response. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. This wasn't just about saving a life anymore. This was about giving it back the life it was meant to have, and that meant preparing for the hardest part. One day, sooner or later, he would have to say goodbye. But not yet. Not until the cub was strong enough to stand on its own. Not until it could face the wild without fear. Ethan had made his choice, and there was no turning back. Winter gave way to spring, and the world around the cabin began to change. The thick layers of snow melted into glistening rivers, the frozen ground thawed to reveal patches of green, and the once dead forest hummed with life again. And so did the cub. It was no longer the weak, shivering creature Ethan had carried through the storm. In just a few months, the little Grizzly had grown stronger, its fur thick and golden in the sunlight. It moved with confidence now, its small frame still far from full grown, but its steps were no longer uncertain. It was learning. Ethan had done everything he could to teach it how to survive. He had taken it on long walks through the wilderness, showing it how to dig for roots, how to track movement in the forest, how to recognize danger. He had watched as it clumsily swatted at fish in the river, missing more than it caught, but improving every day. He had even taken a step back, letting the cub spend time alone outside the cabin, watching from a distance, making sure it could stand on its own. And now, standing at the edge of the forest, Ethan knew. It was time. The cub sat beside him, its large paws pressing into the damp earth. It had grown into a strong young bear, but it was still small, still vulnerable. Ethan knelt beside it, resting a hand against its thick fur. "You know what to do, buddy," he murmured. "You're ready." The cub turned its head slightly, those deep, dark eyes locking onto his. Ethan swallowed hard. He had told himself he was prepared for this moment, that this had always been the plan. But now that it was here, it felt like something was being ripped from his chest. The cub let out a soft, questioning sound. A sound Ethan had come to know well. It was uncertainty, hesitation. Ethan exhaled, You have to go now, he said gently. This is your home. The cub blinked, its ears twitching slightly. For a long moment, it didn't move. And then, finally, slowly, it turned toward the forest. Ethan watched as it took its first steps away from him, its claws sinking into the dirt. It paused once, glancing back. Ethan didn't say anything. He just nodded. And then, just like that, the cub disappeared into the trees. Ethan stood there long after it was gone, staring at the place where it had vanished. He had done the right thing. The bear was where it was meant to be. But then why did it hurt so much? He turned to head back to the cabin, trying to push down the ache in his chest. And then he heard it, a low, familiar rumbling sound. He stopped, turned, and there, at the tree line, the cub stood once more. It didn't come back to him. It didn't move forward. But it did something Ethan would never forget. It let out a deep, rolling sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whimper. A sound of trust, a sound of gratitude, a goodbye. And then, the cub turned and disappeared once more. This time, for good. Ethan stood there in silence, a lump forming in his throat. The cabin had never felt so empty before. But this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Somewhere out there, in the wild where it belonged, a grizzly bear was growing. Stronger, wiser, ready to face the world on its own. And Ethan? He would never forget the little soul that had followed him through the storm, begging for help. And the moment he had realized that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. If this story touched your heart, remember, sometimes the greatest love is knowing when to let go. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this video with someone who loves inspiring stories. Let's spread the message of courage, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between man and nature. What would you have done in Ethan's place? Let us know in the comments below.